Hi and good evening. Welcome everybody to our fifth event of Reading for Change, a reading and book discussion series on the UN SDGs, with the aim of bringing the UN SDGs out of the academic silo closer to the heart of the everyday citizen. Reading for Change is an initiative and event series by the Bangalore Sustainability Forum, Champaka Bookstore, and the Science Gallery Bangalore. For those of you who don't know us, the Bangalore Sustainability Forum is an inter-institutional collective which aims to create bridges across disciplines so that we start thinking and working out of our silos, but come up with cross-disciplinary solutions for a better and more sustainable future for Namma Bangalore. Champaka Bookstore is an independent women-run bookstore here in Bangalore. We curate the series and have an exquisite selection of writers across India and across the world. And Science Gallery Bangalore is a public institution for research-based engagement at the interface between the natural and human sciences, engineering, and the arts. Today, we're going to talk about UN SDG 7, the UN Sustainable Development Goal 7, which is affordable and clean energy. It is something which is very relevant to India, especially also urban India, because one, we do face like the pollution, as well as creating a large amount of the energy demand. And so we chose Rinchin's book, I Will Save My Land, because we wanted to show the connect between like the urban electricity demand and the and what it means to people who are at the source of the energy producing units. And we also wanted to ask this question, like, what does it even mean clean and affordable energy? Is there a form of energy which does not have like a footprint, or which is a feasible and sustainable form of energy for the future, which is affordable for all and has the least consequences for all, or has at least equally distributed consequences? I Will Save My Land is a picture book published by Tulika, and it tells the story of Mati, a young girl in Chhattisgarh who fought hard to get her piece of land from her family. But just when she starts enjoying and working her land, it is being endangered by an upcoming coal mine. And we thought it's really relevant to look at this question from the perspective of a child. So I welcome the author, Rinchin, with us. Hi, Rinchin. Thanks for taking the time to join us. And I welcome Shripad as well, who is an expert in different forms of energy and has worked also with people in areas where coal mining happens. So welcome, and thank you for joining us, and enjoy the discussion. For the audience, we will have about like 20 to 30 minutes of conversation with Rinchin and Shripad, starting with the reading of the book. And then we will open for questions from the audience. Enjoy.
So, should I start?
Yes, please, Rinchin.
Yes,
That would be fabulous.
Okay.
If you could show, no, yeah, yes.
So I'll start with the reading an excerpt from the story. I'll try to read it in two parts, some part from the beginning and then we'll go to the end. मेरा खेत है, said Mati angrily. तेरा खेत तू अपनी सासुबाड़ी में ढूंढना, said her father lightly. You're a fine one to say this, said her grandmother, for someone who's been brought up alone by his mother. Her grandmother's tone was not light, it was sharp. Her father became serious. Dai, why are you angry? I was just joking. But her grandmother was not easily pacified. How much I've had to fight to keep my land. Just to plow the land, I had to go against the whole village. They used to laugh at me. It's taken me so long to get my rights, and now you say things like this? Even in jest, it hurts. Now her grandmother had moved over to the tomatoes and was plucking them row by row, as if putting a distance between her and her father. Her father got and moved towards his mother, sitting by her side, speaking to her. It looked like he was trying to make up for his words, knowing that somehow Dadi was also angry with her father. Mati too went to sit beside her. Both looked at him in anger. Are you both never going to forgive me for my unthinking words? He said. No, because we know what's in your heart. You think like all the other men, Dadi said back. Good that your daughter is smarter than me, and just as stubborn, her father said back. Had I not been stubborn, we would not have had this land. And at this, her father was defeated. He smiled a sheepish smile and got back to his work. Mati knew that the fields that they worked on now were her grandmother's parents' field. Grandmother was their only child. When her parents died, grandmother had come back to claim her field. But when she came back, she found that some of the upper caste people had taken her land. This land, they said, was the village land. Her parents had a right on it till they were alive. Now that they were dead, it came back to the panchayat. And what claim did she have on the land that she should stake her claim in her? And if she had, she should stake her claim in her Sasurbadi. And since when did people of lower caste start passing on land from generation to generation? But Dadi fought as hard as she could. She went to court. She stood up against all the so-called upper caste villagers who had come to threaten her daily. Often they would leave their animals on her standing crop. Dadi stood and fought, and finally, through a court case, got what was her right, even though it was only half. Later, her daddy seemed to have forgiven Mati's father, and she was back to talking to him normally. But the thought that the khet was not hers kept worrying Mati. She decided that she should have her own khet. Now, every day she kept pestering her father and her daddy, give me my khet, I want my own khet. So one day when her daddy went to the market to get a small pawda, the daddy gave it to Mati and took her to the side of the three trees. There she marked out a small square. And then, with Mati by her side, they took steps, 20 to each side, and marked out a square. Here, this is your khet, your doli, said Dadi. Now look after it. What shall I grow in it? तो का उगाबे खेत में मैं सबला उगाऊं धान टमाटर भिंडी झुनगा आलू she was greedy, she wanted to grow everything. So what if the big bari? So whatever the big bari had, she had a miniature of that on hers. Every day, her grandmother would give her advice, and she would do as grandmother told her. And every day she would work hard, straight from school, channeling water, making a small boundary, planting, and then weeding. She would always help her grandmother in the other fields, but her main attention was on her own patch. She wouldn't let her father near her fields. You go work on your own field, this is mine. Her father would laugh and start working on his fields. The others would call out to her, why Noni, your body is very good, the best in the village, and she would feel very proud. Meanwhile, there were meetings happening in the village. Her grandmother always went to attend them. Sometimes she went with her. It seemed that a big coal mine was going to come to their village, and the companies were trying to buy up their land. Sometimes the company people would come to the village and ask people to come and attend their meetings. They asked them to sell their land to them even before the government came to ask for it. In return, they would get a lot of money. In the village, the view was divided. Some were willing to give up the land, but many of the small farmers were not. Why should we give up our land? The money will go before we know it. Farming was what they knew. How would we live without the land? It was okay for the big farmers. They knew what to do with their money. But the small farmers, what would they do? And what about those who had no land of their own? Where would they go? Some other people from villages the where there already was a coal mine started to come to their village for meetings. Once her grandmother and father went to another village for a meeting. Mati went with them. The village was next to a coal mine. The road was dusty. Black coal dust coated the road in the village where there were some empty houses. Those had been sold and no one knew where the people were. But those that were still left had been making barriers between their land and the mine, making it as their land so that no one could come in without their permission. The adults were taken around, and as they reached the edge of the village, her grandmother cursed loudly as she saw the deep hole in the ground. It was huge. Mati felt her stomach fall. The mine was a huge black hole with a large mountain of coal waste behind it. Is that what would happen to her village, to her khet? The meetings went on till late night. Mati played with other children, and for a while she forgot about her khet, the mine, and her worries about it. The children had already eaten and were falling asleep by the time the grown ups came back. She got up and it was dark. Lying in one corner of the room, snuggled against the other children, she saw the grown ups eat. Sitting in rows, young boys and girls serving them. There was a lot of chatter. Then, to her surprise, she saw that one half of the group got up, did go home to sleep, but the others were lighting lamps and getting ready to go out back again. Where are they going? She asked her new friends. To guard the village boundary. Turn by turn, they will sit and do peredari every night so that the bulldozers don't come. The bulldozers, yes, and the JCB too. What is a JCB? Whispered Mati. It's a big machine. It has a big pawra for a mouth. It digs up land and gets to the coal. ये कंपनी वाले बहुत कमीने हैं. रात को आ जाते हैं, सुबह उठते हैं तो जमीन गायब. Now Mati's fear and worry grew. Just when she had managed to get her own khet and was worrying about her father sending her away to her Sasurbadi, here was a company much bigger than them all trying to take away her khet. Next morning, they started back to their village early. She said bye to her new friends. No one did much work that day. Her grandmother cooked a simple meal for lunch and they slept away their tiredness. In the evening, Mati went to see her patch. It didn't look much worse from one day of neglect. Then she went to play. There were many stories that she had to tell her friends. At night, when her grandmother went to the neighbor's house, Mati quietly took her pavla and a torch and went out. When her grandmother came back, she found her missing. Noni, kahan gayi thi? She asked Mati's father. She was there a little while ago, he said, looking around. When they didn't find her in any corner of the house, they went looking for her. Her father went out from the front and her grandmother went to the back. In the torchlight, she saw her sleeping with a pavda near her patch. What are you doing here, Noni? Said grandmother softly as she picked her up. In her sleep, she felt her grandmother's warm body envelop her. It had been cold, and she was cold too. She was happy for the comfort of her grandmother's warmth. यहाँ काबर सोता था नूनी? Why are you sleeping here, Nuni? We were looking everywhere for you. Her grandmother's voice was filled with anger and confusion, but also love. मैं मोर जमीन ला बचावत हूँ. I'm trying to save my land. Her grandmother hugged her tight, and once inside the house, she put her on the mat, pulling a blanket over her. Then she lay down beside her, sighing. Yes, Noni, tor zameen la bachana hai. Yes, we will save your land. But what we do, we will have to do it for the rest of our lives. But sleep well tonight.
Yeah, thank you, Rinchin. I think that was such a moving story, and unfortunately, it is, uh, I think, such a part of the everyday life of people who are in those areas from where rest of the country gets its energy, mainly in the form of coal, energy, electricity. And I think we often hear about these debates and discussions about energy and electricity and how it should be clean and sustainable. And, those discussions, when you hear this kind of stories and when you see them, and I have had the privilege to actually move around in so many of these areas. Uh, that reality is so different from the dry and the kind of technical discussions that we often see when the authorities, the environment ministry, the power ministry, the researchers, they talk about sustainability, they talk about having access to clean energy. And it's almost as if these two ends are in two different worlds. So I think what I would like to say is that, because we are talking about the SDGs, and the SDG7 talks about access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy sources for all. Um, I think it's very important for us to understand what is happening at the other end of, or the area from where all this electricity and energy is coming. Uh, India, though, of course, we have been talking about other forms of renewable energy, but even today, coal-based electricity is our major source of energy. Electricity, I think it's probably around maybe more than 70%, 75% of our electricity still comes from coal. And it seems that this situation is going to be there at least for the next couple of decades. While coal's importance is going down, it will remain a substantial source of electricity for the country. So then, is that energy really sustainable, and what does it mean? What is the reality? I think that is what has been captured by one part of that is being captured of that. And I think the last sentence is very, very moving, that yes, we have to save our land, but it's not a one day's thing. It is something that we are going to have to do for the rest of our lives. I think that is the reality for most of the people who are there around coal mines, around power plants from where we get our electricity. And just to again, talk about how it's seen at the other end. You look at this, the rarefied talks about SDGs and all. So the SDG7 talks about sustainable energy, and unfortunately, sustainability there seems to be seen only in terms of this clean or clean energy, which essentially means maybe no emissions. And even there, it is seen really in terms of just carbon often. And I think this is quite a big concern. Uh, I think when we talk about sustainability, when we talk about clean energy, particularly in the Indian context, then I think there are many other dimensions which we need to look at. Land is one of the probably the most important, that for generating any kind of energy, people have to give up their lands. And not just lands, because it's not land as in a property, but the land means everything to them. I think again, this story brings out so much of the attachment that people have, right from the time that children to the time they are grown-ups, because land is their livelihood. That's the only livelihood they know. And it's not easy to replace that land by just giving some monetary compensation, because that is spent away so soon, and nothing is left in the hands of the people, and they really know very few other means of livelihood. So land is one very, very important part of sustainability. But I think hidden behind that land are also other elements or other aspects which are important. I think some of the other SDGs do mention them, but when you look at energy, I think it's very important to understand those. For example, participation and consent. If I have coal lying beneath my land, do I have a say in whether the coal will be mined or not? Or just that the government says that, okay, we are going to take away your land. And now increasingly with the opening of the coal mines for commercial exploitation, where recently auctions have been carried out, and a number of private companies have bid and have won bids to mine the coal. So it's now the company who will come in and say that, look, okay, there is coal beneath your land, and we are going to take that coal, so we don't have to move. Is that inevitable? Do people have a say or not? So I think there are many dimensions when we talk about sustainability, when we talk about clean energy. It's not just about emission, but it's about justice. It's about the say that people have. It's also about, even if they are ready to consent to move out and allow the exploitation of the coal, what happens to them? Do they actually get any sustainable livelihoods? Forget about sustainable livelihoods. I would also have this question: do they actually even get a benefit of the electricity that is generated? And I have visited some of the areas, presumably where Rinchin is working. Presumably, this story is set in some of that areas, and I visited that area. And it is so typical. The villages which have made way and who have given part of their land for the coal mines, they face hours and hours of power cut. They face low voltage situation through the many hours, and a complete power cut in so many hours. So, so what does this mean? So I think all these aspects are very much are related, and I think it will be very interesting to hear Rinchin talk about some of these aspects, taking off from the story. As one can see, that story is just a snippet from the whole life of the people around the mines and around the power plants. So maybe it would be important if Rinchin is able to talk a bit more, going beyond that story, or taking us to what is not written now in the story. The story, of course, ends at one point, but life doesn't end there. So what is happening there? And maybe give us the real picture of the sustainability or otherwise of the India's largest energy source, that is coal. Thanks, Rinchin.
So actually, I think you said, you already pointed out to the fact that when we talk about, it's not just about emissions, and it's not just, when we talk about clean and sustainable energy, it's not just about that. And also, the effects that we know are much beyond. There is one aspect of pollution and the kind of health effects that the mining has on communities that live around it, and it's actually very it's a revelation to know that even when people talked about environment impacts, or they talk about their when public hearings for coal mines are heard, or when or the parameters that are there for environmental clearances to mines and power plants around the mines, there has been no there really has been very little done, or very little attention paid to the health impacts. What is the health impact on the people who live around coal mines and power plants? There's very little that in terms of, like, when we're talking of children, because this story it centers around a child. What happens to the education of these children? What happens when people are displaced? How does it socially affect people? And are these places that we talk about where mining is going on better off? The people living there, are they better off from what they were before the mining happened, or worse off? That's something that needs to be seen. And there has been a lot of information, and there are so many different movements going on where people have been saying that they are worse off than when they started, before mines came up. So the cost of development, and when coal is mined, who gets the energy and who pays the cost, is something that people have been talking. We feel that they've been talking a lot about, but somehow in the mainstream, I don't think that is something that when we consume energy, we think of. We don't think of the cost that people pay with their health, with their lives, because when you lose your land, or when you're displaced, it's not just about the land. There is a whole um, there's a whole loss of so many things, no? There is also the kind of price that people pay for fighting, because every time when people lose their land, like we're saying, there is no clean energy, there is no clean displacement either, there is no clean acquisition of land. There is so much corruption in between. There are benami transfers of land, people being duped of the kind of compensation money that they should be getting. So much that happens, so much disruption of people's lives that happen, approaching courts, fighting. It takes away a whole chunk of your life, and it is a struggle that becomes that struggle against the mind, the struggle for clean water, the struggle for clean air, the things that we take for granted. in cities, and I think the larger upper class people and the kind of spaces that we inhabit, what is taken for granted is very different from the struggle that people have to do for those basic amenities in these communities. And so I think that is something that we need to think about much more. I think the cost that other people pay for the amenities that we get, especially when we talk of energy, whether it is the workers who work in the coal mines, whether it is these communities, and also the kind of here when we're talking about also the kind of government response and who the government really stands for, because in the past years we've seen that there is very little that is being done for the communities that are losing their land and their livelihoods to coal mines, and much more is being done to protect the corporate interest. So that is also something that we need to think of. And I think that's the crux of this matter. And when the last line, like you said about the story, that the struggle is something that we'll have to do for that that will become a part of our lives. That's true, because people pay not just when they fight for their environment, and which is when they fight for their environment, it is an environment that affects all of us, but it is the most marginalized that is at the forefront of these struggles. And any change that happens, we all get that, like when we talk of clean energy, but while we talk of it, it is people on the road that are most marginalized, most affected, that are on the road. They are the people who are leaving who are losing paid taking days out of their lives to fight, and also being penalized for it. So many people have court cases against them, people who have every day that struggle. You've seen that many people know that so many false cases against people, not just activists, but people who didn't want to. This is not something that they chose. It's something that comes into their lives because someone decides that something like this will happen here today. So that kind of disruption also, and how it makes everyone, like, just surviving is you become a sort of, like, you become a warrior for the environment because of the need to survive, and the whole concept of justice gets inverted. People who are fighting in most places if we see that when people talk about when people protest, or or the struggles that are going on the field, what are people asking for? They're just asking for laws to be followed. They're asking, that's all that they're doing. They're not asking for anything. They're just asking that if there is a law for the environment, if we are saying that the environment needs to be preserved, if we are saying that land acquisition needs to be done in a certain way, then those laws need to be followed. What is happening now, that even those laws are not followed, and then we are coming up with worse laws that make it even more difficult. And so the laws are also changing, but whatever little is offered in the law, that's also not being followed. And the state, which needs to protect its citizens, actually turning a blind eye to, and like becoming apathetic towards them. So that's something also that when we talk about sustainable energy or clean environment, that's something that needs to be seen. And lastly, I'll say that because these places are not in the public eye, are not places that we hear of. So when Delhi the PM 2.5 levels go to say 200 or something, there is a huge outcry. The Supreme Court also takes cognizance of it, and then there are things that odd and even numbers and all that happens. But like the place that we are talking about, where the story is set, there the PM 2.0 levels are as high as 350, and people are talking about it, but they have to go to court to get and fight for 6-7 years to even get acknowledgement that yeah, there is something wrong and that has to be remedied. So that's also the kind of like that kind of marginality also of geographically which places are protected and which are not, whose lives matter and whose life don't matter. That's also something that needs to be seen.
Yeah, I think one of the most important points that Rinchin has made in this very graphic picture which she has painted is that there is a complete failure of all the institutions, the legal regulatory bodies, the legal bodies, regulatory bodies, which are supposed to actually ensure that the laws are followed. If you look at the law books, if you look at the regulations, there's a fairly decent, of course, it's not completely, adequate, but at least there are certain laws, regulations regarding pollution, regarding land acquisition, regarding rights of people. But the very agencies which are supposed to ensure that this happening have completely and abysmally failed in ensuring that. So the onus of ensuring that even the smallest regulation is followed comes on the people. And the people, as Richard mentioned, who are among the most marginalized. So if the people have to go out to the collector office to make a small application saying that you look, the law is not being followed and the fly ash from the coal power plant, for example, is being thrown on the open land. Even to make that one application, that person has to forego his or her daily wage, has to spend out of his pocket to travel all the way, and getting an appointment with a collector is itself such a big problem. So the onus of proving or the onus of doing the job of the regulatory agencies comes on the most marginalized people, and they have to go through such a lot of turmoil and again to even prove the smallest thing, which they are not able to prove. Just to give you some glimpses of what is happening around and what is happening in such a blatant manner, let me share a couple of pictures, a few pictures, which again, this was, some of them are from the very area in Raigad in Chhattisgarh where Rinchin is working and where that story is set, but they could be just be from anywhere. They are so common. So for example, let me share this picture of fly ash. As some of you would be aware, or many of you would be aware, when coal burns, then ash is generated. And ash is one of the biggest pollutants in this country. It's the biggest solid waste in this whole country. It's twice or three times the municipal solid waste. So we generate so much of coal ash. Last year, I think the coal ash that was generated in this country was about 200 million tons. So, and by law, it is supposed to be 100% reutilized. Now, this is a picture of a fly ash dump near the Tamnar power plant in Chhattisgarh. Now, this is ostensibly what they are doing is they are reclaiming low-lying land. Now, in the environment clearance given to this project, they are not supposed to use the ash for reclaiming low-lying land. And in any case, reclaiming low-lying land is a euphemism for dumping ash on perfectly good land. Now, remember, this fly ash contains all sorts of toxic elements like chromium and cadmium and mercury. And when it rains, then all this is going to leach out into the water bodies, into the fields of the farmers. So, that is the, just 1 minute, I need to move it. Okay, I don't know if this can be seen on the screen. This is what happens when, is the screen being seen?
Yes, yes, it is. Thank you.
Yeah. So this is what happens when this is what happens when that fly ash dump which we saw, this one, when the rain washes it into water bodies or into the farms. This is another ash dump in the same region from another power plant, and you can see how the rain has taken all the ash into the fields, and actually from here it goes into a nala. So it just gets into the local water bodies. This is a picture from somewhere else. This is actually from Mettur, where there is a coal-based power plant in Tamil Nadu, Mettur in Tamil Nadu. And this is a settlement, a village, a group of people. This is not a village, this is an urban area. But this is a settlement where near the coal handling plant. And they are supposed to do all kinds of precautions. They are supposed to have a green belt. They are supposed to keep sprinkling water so that the coal dust doesn't, go out. But actually, this settlement and settlements around that coal handling plant for several kilometers are full of coal dust, and the people are sick of it. And of course, this leads to all kinds of things because the coal dust leads to asthma and so many other diseases. Now, this, is just some glimpses of what is happening. And uh, in many places, the people are just not able to raise these issues because, they are often not organized and they are not able to make themselves heard in the authorities. There are places where people do get organized, they get some support, and they are able to raise this issue. And even then, what happens? Again, I will talk about the experience in Chhattisgarh where Rinchin has been working and what they have done. They have been persistently and systematically been raising the issue of the pollution since at least 6 or 7 years, she mentioned. And ultimately, they got a victory of sorts when the National Green Tribunal said that yes, these companies which have been mining coal have been consistently violating the conditions of the environment clearance, and they have led to environmental problems around, and they were told to first stop it. And 160 crores of fine, they were fined. Jindal and SECL, these two companies were fined 160 crores, which is a very small part of all the damage they have done, but at least some of the damage was recognized and that has been done. Now, you would say that this is great, but I think it's more than what now, 3 years, Rinchin, since this order has come. And it has been going like a football between the National Green Tribunal and the Supreme Court, then coming back, then going back. And people have to keep pushing it, in the court. They have to keep going to hearings, raising the same arguments again and again. And even till date, that's such a simple thing as that fine, they have not been able to actually make the company pay. Now, this is the reality of a case where people have spent money from their pockets, they have foregone livelihoods, they have had false cases against them. And 6 or 7 years down the line, in spite of the legal recognition, it's still not, the company is still not paid because they have immense staying power. They have a lot of money to hire big lawyers. Uh, they have the regulatory agencies in their pockets. The government supports them. And then, what you have is the marshalling of evidences to such an extent that I want to show, one of the, again, just a small thing that this was one of the reports which was recently done as a health assessment. Again, the Sangathan there, the organization there, actually got the help of some NGOs who came there and did a health survey. Using that health survey, strongly the issue was raised, and for once an official health assessment of those villages was done, which has come out with some very, very strong findings that the coal mining and the power plants which are there in that area have led to severe health impacts on the people. Now, in the face of this evidence, forget about any compensation to the existing people who have been suffering. What has happened is, in spite of this evidence, the Environment Ministry has gone ahead and given environment clearance to more mines in the same area. So this is the reality which what we are finding in what is, on the other hand, we have the, SDG 12, which talks about sustainable production and talks about how there should be environmentally sound management of chemicals and all the wastes. And, you have other SDGs which talk about inequality and inclusive industrialization. But what is happening on the ground is completely a farce that is playing out. In 80% or 90% of the cases, the people are simply not even able to sustain such a kind of a struggle, is not able to bring out all this. As I said, the onus is somehow on the people to bring this fact out. The regulatory agencies never do their jobs. So unfortunately, even where the people are able to do it, the reality is that the companies it's a battle of attrition. The companies with their staying power can just keep on pushing things and not pay the fine, not be held accountable. On the other side, we have more and more mines and power plants being opened up in the same area. So I don't know, Rinchin, what would you like to say? What do the people feel and do in such a situation?
I think it's like you said already, and people people are fighting because it's a question of survival. So whether it is about land, or it is whether saving their forest. I mean, we are not talking about it, but this whole thing of like the forest cover going, and also people losing forest on which they are dependent, apart from the land that So forest does not have independent ownership, but it is something that for the tribal population, that is again not just a source of livelihood, but also it is also a source of life. It is also something that is very important to survival and to sustainability of the of lives. And so because one is dependent on forests in so many ways. So that the constantly fighting to guard that, and the government going completely opposite to what they claim to do now, whether they talk of forest, or whether they talk of the environment, or for everything. Like if you see of every so-called sustainable goal, whether it is about talking about women's empowerment or whatever, what is the kind of impact that coal mine has on women's lives? What is the kind of impact it has on the education of children, on health, on everything? If you see it, it goes completely against all the so-called empowerment or the schemes that the government talks about, when it talks about development. It doesn't seem to. There is a complete disconnect. And the fact that like this ICMR report that has come in an area which says that which is a government report saying that there is an adverse impact on the health of the people, of the communities living around coal mines. And there is a court case in which the National Green Tribunal has admitted that these places are past their carrying capacity, and they need to be, any further mining needs to be looked at very thoroughly. And you have a ministry that is still giving green signal, and apart from that, there is a public outcry. There are people protesting on the streets, in public hearings, through Gram Sabha prastavs. So everything that is supposed to be done, people are doing. They're going to courts, they're using their Gram Sabhas, they're using the laws, everything to try to oppose or to try to protect their lives and livelihoods, their forests. And on the other hand, you have a government that is going constantly against laws, and where it needs to, it's changing laws. So a few years back, there was a government team that had come to visit that area, and it had like one of the people, every time they come, they seem to be surprised by what they see. And then they were asking people that, "Aap itne din se lad kaise rahe ho? How come you're fighting for so long?" And I think one lady, Bhagwati Bhagat, who's also one of the petitioners in the case and is a long woman leader in the area, said कि लड़ेंगे नहीं तो मरेंगे. In Chhattisgarh, she said लड़बो नहीं तो मरबो. So it's not even it's not a choice that one makes. It is the struggle for survival. So if you don't fight, you succumb. So how that's that's what people everywhere, like people who are struggling, are doing. Now it is up to us. It is up to people who have a choice of which side they want to stand on. And I think the onus is now, when we're talking about the government, that is one, but when we're also talking about the larger civil society, when we're talking about people who are talking about energy issues, are talking about clean air, scientists, everyone. Now we have to decide where we want to stand. because we gain. To a large extent, we gain from the losses that people incur somewhere else. We gain from the fact that in many of the areas the Adivasi land is being lost. We gain, whether it is in terms of malls, whether it is in terms of the electricity that we are getting. So it is for now, for also for us. The fight can't just be on the people who are being affected. It also has to be, because we also will have to answer. And I think that is something that that needs to be like something that I think um, when we, the reason that, like when you read a story like this, or when you I think it is for people to see that they have to decide whether they want to stand with Mati and her people and support that struggle, or with the powers that are causing the destruction. And we can't be silent spectators. Like I said, that जब दिल्ली में होता है तो फिर लोग खड़े होते हैं, or when it affects their own health, people stand. But when it's something that is not, it's far from us, we tend to not know. But now I think we have to reach out, we have to learn more, we cannot be ignorant, because that is something, that's a privilege that we have of not knowing, and continuing not to know is an exploitation of that privilege. So I think I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Rinchin, and thank you so much, Shripad, for laying this out so well. I would like to, look, we will open the Q&A now, and coming from what you said and also what our first question is, and what Shripad also said, I would like to say a few things about the SDGs, because the SDGs, like Shripad said, are all interconnected. And what you just pointed out is that at the moment we gain and others at the cost of others. But one of the SDGs is also reduced inequalities. So we should also strive to like those reduced inequalities, and see our privileged positions as being like, I mean, I guess I speak for almost all of us that probably all of us are in the top 2% in the income and education bracket in India. So it is only fair that we use this to support those who are at the moment at the end that they're bearing like a lot of the costs that that we create by our lifestyle. And now I'm opening the first question from Sharat Chandra Lele, who rightfully pointed out that the SDGs are called the Sustainable Development Goals. And the question here is like, is it the right choice of words, or like it does not say just equitable or just or equitable or democratic, and is that part of the problem? One quick response from my side to that before I give it to Rinchin, before I let Rinchin and Shripad respond. The last SDG 17 is actually speaking about like peace and justice. So while the SDGs as such are sustainable development goals, they do include the notion that we should strive to just an equitable society. The question is just like, what does it mean for the different countries of the world? And especially for India, it will be, again, like a very, it's a very unique situation. And yeah, we need to see how can we achieve that, and what can we contribute as urban citizens or as citizens of the uppermost percentage to move towards more equity for all of us, for all citizens or all people living in this country.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So maybe I can start with responding to what Sharad has said. I think, yes, we are discussing this in the context of the SDGs, and whether the problem is in the framing, I'm not sure. I think if you look at the SDGs, they read so well. I mean, the framing is, it says all the right things. First of all, of course, it says that all the SDGs are interrelated. So, in theory, we are not supposed to see each one of them separately. We are supposed to look at them together. And so if there is a SDG for sustainable energy and equity, then there is an SDG which talks about reducing inequality or inequity, and there is one which talks about inclusive industrialization. There is one which, and that has a specific thing about participatory, structures. There is one which talks about sustainable production. So I think it's not so much about maybe framing, but I think in terms of how do we interpret those in our discourse. And there, I think, is really the catch. I mean, because, we have seen how the discourse in this country has framed even the most destructive projects as sustainable and equitable. And, for example, hydropower, and my own kind of bit of my history of my work, I have been involved in the struggle around the Narmada Dam project. And one of the things which we had to fight for many, many years was just to shift the discourse of looking at hydropower as clean and green and renewable, and try to show different facets in which how come this that these large hydro themselves are highly destructive of the environment, of the people. They are non-participatory. So there are I think it's really what is important is how these are being interpreted and what is actually happening on the ground. How do we frame those? And what is the reality of these words, equity, sustainability, in the Indian context, in the day-to-day lives of the people who are fighting it on the ground? I think that is really the key thing. And I think to bring that reality out and to frame discourse in terms of their daily lives, I think that is very important. And I think that's also the essence of participation. That's also the essence of those who are actually bearing the brunt of all this. What do they think about this? I think that for that to come out, I think that's what I would say is very important. If Rinchin wants to add something to that, or we can go to the next question.
No, I think we can go to the next question. Yeah.
Okay, so Rinchin, maybe you can start then with this question. What is the compensation given to these people? Is it that they are giving monetary compensation or an alternative piece of land? Also, it's quite dangerous for people working in coal mines. Are they insured? Also, when the entire world is talking about renewable resources, why are we so much reliant on coal just because it's inexpensive?
Yeah, so the whole issue of compensation is, again, like, it's a very fraught one. There is the whole thing of compensation. What all will you be compensated for? So for land, there is a government policy, of course, of under the Act, and what is the in the Land Acquisition Act. So what is the price for land, and what is the compensation that people when the land gets taken over either by government or by a private party. One is the whole whether people have the choice to decide whether or not they want to give the land. So first is that, like, before even the compensation, whether or not they want to give the land, and especially in tribal areas where there is PESA, and where there is an act where their consent is supposed to be taken, and also the Forest Rights Act. So whether or not they participate in the decision for whether they can decide whether or not they want the land, then what the rate of the land will be. So that's something. And what about people, like when we talk about compensation, what about people who do not have land but who are dependent on land-based work? For example, who work on other people's land, who work as sharecroppers, people who have their kids in the forest but do not have entitlements. Like even under the Forest Rights Act, there are so many people who've not still been given the entitlements that they're due under the Forest Rights Act. So what happens to all that? And even if we just talk of compensation, there is so much that goes on. Mostly Adivasi land is usually bought over by companies even before the land acquisition comes into place. So a lot of land through Benami transfers is bought over on much lesser prices than the price that the companies or the government would have to pay, and taken under false names, that's called Benami transfers. And there are so many such 498A cases, which means that Adivasi lands, Adivasis being defrauded of their land and being given very little, paid very little than what the compensation should be. So there are like many issues. Is even the government compensation that is promised enough? Are people asked for what, whether or not they want to give their land? Do they have that choice? To the kind of corruption that happens even before the land is acquired. So a lot of people are not even able to get whatever the government policy compensation for the land is. And then most people would want land for land, but now there is no scheme in which people are given land instead of the land that so it is a cash compensation, and many people are not able to buy the same amount of land that they get compensated for. So even because the land around the places, like once you know that there is land, there is people are losing the land and getting compensated for it, the land prices in the surrounding areas also go up accordingly. So if you lose, like say 2 acres of land, you're able to buy probably 1 acre of land. That's the kind of, so whether you actually benefit from it. So there are many of these things that it's not as simple as whether the compensation is enough or not. To a large extent, that is not enough. But even if it were, there is many things that happen around it. Also, there are many other ways in which people are defrauded of the money also that they get. For example, there are these false bima companies, people who come and you must have heard of the many chit fund companies that actually almost preyed like vultures on people once they got compensation and told people that they would safe keep their money for them, and then they got and largely Adivasis got defrauded of their compensation, so they were left with no land and almost no money. So there are all these things that happen. That was the first part of the question. What was the second part?
The second part was that also when the entire world is talking about renewable resources, why are we so much reliant on coal just because it's inexpensive?
Yeah, and also about what you were saying about the workers. Again, with the workers, there are two issues. One is that there is this policy that land losers will be given jobs. And while they're promised that they're given jobs, most of them don't get permanent jobs. So they get jobs under contractors, which are almost like daily wage earning jobs. And for a long time, the private companies that have been working in most areas now that with the government, with commercial coal mining, and also this under Surface Rights Act, where there are a lot of private companies now mining coal. Most people work under contract wage, and they have not even been able to enforce that these private companies pay the minimum coal wage board wages. So again, in this also, the increase in any wages, or like this fight for having basic workers' rights for the contract workers also, is something that the workers have to wage themselves. They have to fight, they have to organize, they have to constantly raise their voices to be able to get what the law gives them, which is also not and which to a large extent, I think very few private companies, or I would say none, pay the minimum coal wage board payments to the workers that work in the mines. The conditions, of course, are not great, and people who work in underground mines suffer from many kinds of illnesses, and also not just underground mine, but even in open cast mine with a very high PM 2.5 levels, the lungs are something that are affected. And as we said, there are so many other kinds of heavy metals that have been found in air and water. And right now, because there has been there's not been so many scientific studies that have been done also on the kind of effects that have, we don't even know in different ways how in many different ways people are getting affected. So I think, yes, simply because it's cheaper, one sticks to it, people stick to it, because if these companies had or if they were forced to adhere to every environmental law, if they really had to pay the workers the amount of wages that they were supposed to pay, if they had to take care of many of the different things, whether it was in terms of environment, in terms of labor and wages, if it was in terms of afforestation, if they had to do all that, it would not be so cheap. It is cheap because they circumvent everything else, and they get away with a lot of violations. So it is something that they're able to continue and sustain.
Thank you, Rinchin. Shripad, would you like to add some points, or shall we go to the next question?
I think we can go to the next question. We can go to the next question.
So then we have a few questions from YouTube. Starting with what can we do as responsible consumers? Is 100% shift to renewables the way ahead? And that also ties into the question we were discussing amongst each other before this talk. What even is energy? What is a source of considerable clean energy at the moment?
Sorry, can you repeat the last sentence because I didn't hear it properly?
Of course. So the question is, what can we do as responsible consumers? Is 100% shift to renewables the way ahead?
Okay, so that I heard. I thought you had added something. So I think this also ties up to the last part of the earlier question, which was asked, why are we so reliant on coal? Is it because it's inexpensive? So I think what we can do as responsible consumers, and is 100% shift to renewables the way ahead? So short answer, yes, of course. I think we must ensure, if not 100%, I don't know whether 100% is feasible, but we must ensure, as much as possible, or a very significant shift to renewables. But I think that's only part of the story, because I think we must understand that any energy source will have an impact. Any energy source has a footprint. So I think we must first of all recognize that. Often the discourse of coal versus solar or coal versus wind is also posited in a way that everything is bad about coal and everything is good about solar. And I think that's a very dangerous discourse. I think we must recognize that solar, wind, other renewables, if they are also, rolled out on a large scale, they'll have their own impacts. So I think, yes, we must shift to renewables like solar and others, but we must have a recognition that they will have impacts. And then when we do that, we must then make sure that it is done within a framework where all these things that we are talking about, we don't do those in the same way that we were doing coal, say, or we were doing nuclear, or we are doing large hydro. In the sense that we must look at how land is obtained for solar. We must look at how land is obtained, whether there is consent of the people, whether there is participation, whether these are done with a proper assessment of the impacts. Today, for example, the entire environment impact assessment framework and the laws don't require any environment impact assessment for solar and wind, which is ridiculous. And as a result, for example, some of the big fights have been around the impacts of wind. We have seen some of the biggest fights some of the most intense protests have taken place around wind power, whether it is in near Pune, near Bhimashankar, or in some other places. So I think yes, probably solar is much less impactful than coal, but it has its impact. So to bring them in the ambit of that impact assessment. This is one part of it. But I think the second part, and which is most important, is we must also look at the use part. We are looking at the supply side, we are looking at the generation of electricity, and there we must definitely look at the impacts of environment, whether it is of coal or solar or wind. And we must try to minimize those impacts. We must ensure participation. We must ensure, that the first right of the benefits which are created from this project go to those who are impacted or affected. But we must also look at the use side. And I think ultimately we need to ask ourselves this question: how much electricity do we need to use in the ultimate analysis? Because if we say that there is no end to that, then you can be rest assured there will be no end to the impacts. So I think we must ask this overarching question. And that is not to say, I think many times when we ask this question, then people say, oh, do you want to keep our people poor? No, I think we must ask this question in the context that yes, there are many people, millions of people in this country who probably need to increase their consumption of electricity, of material resources, but there are many people who probably need to cut down. And we definitely need to ask this question that as a country, what is it that we see 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line, 20 years down the line? What is the ultimate per capita consumption of electricity that we want? And towards what end? What are the goals that that consumption will serve? Will it serve the consumption? Will that electricity consumption serve the goals of basic needs of food, living, shelter, health, or will it serve some other needs? I think these are the questions we need to ask when we talk about a shift to renewables. It's not just a shift to renewables in isolation of all these larger questions. So I would say that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I absolutely agree with that. In the interest of time, we take one last question, which is directed to you, Shripad. It is from Satyajit Mayer. And he asked whether you could elaborate on your journey from being part of the NBA to what you're doing now and your perceptions on what lies ahead in the struggle for equity and justice.
Yes. So, I think I was a full-time activist within Narmada Bachao Andolan, and there the kind of role that I played was multifaceted, as I think Rinchin will also say, agree that when you are in a struggle like this, then you play all possible roles from cooking and cleaning to planning protest actions, to doing analysis, to doing mobilization. So that was a part and parcel of all the kinds of things that I was doing as a part of the Narmada struggle, looking at analyzing the sort of the project, its impacts, but also mobilizing people, being a part of the protest actions, facing whatever the people were facing. Of course, I was always, even within that, more privileged, because ultimately I had a choice. My land, my life, my livelihood was not at stake. But even then, try to be as much a part of what the entire struggle was about. But I think that from there, I also felt the need to answer some of the larger questions using a much more analytical framework, using analysis, because uh, protest actions on the ground are very critical, but we also need analysis to be able to answer some of the immediate questions, some of the broader questions. So I felt that maybe it was also important for me, given my own background and in certain ways also giving my own privileged position, that maybe I should also try to look at some of these larger questions. And because of that, I decided to move out of the kind of day-to-day participation in the struggle. I'm still, of course, connected with the NBA, but I tried to move out of that and set up this small group called Manthan, which now does more analytical work. So we still try and look at the same questions of sustainability, equity, justice, but also try to see how what are the broader answers to some of these questions, both technical, but also in terms of frameworks, in terms of regulatory and governance issues, what can be the regulatory and governance structures, and how they can be empowered. And ultimately, I think what are my perceptions on what lies ahead in the struggle for equity and justice? I think that ultimately it is for all of us to be, somehow be a part of this struggle for equity and justice. And we can do that in many, many different ways. In, of course, our own personal lifestyles, that is very important. But I think it's many times the choice is not just about individual lifestyles. In fact, that's a kind of a, false solution. The system is very clever. There, for example, just this, for example, people say, I won't use an automobile and I'll use a bicycle. Yes, but the entire structure is set up so that it becomes more and more difficult for you to use a bicycle. Okay. So we have to answer some of the questions at a systemic level. So I think all of us need to be a part and parcel of this fight against equity, for equity and for justice, by individual lifestyle, but also by asking questions, by doing whatever we are doing with honesty and integrity. And I think ultimately being not being afraid to stand up for the right things. And by standing up, it can just mean making a post on Facebook or Twitter, but it can also mean taking a stand where many things may be at stake. So I think ultimately it is that we need to stand up and be counted. So I think that's a kind of a broad answer I would like to give. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that almost also answered another question we had gotten on YouTube, which says, why don't we, including probably SDGs, strive to tackle the root cause of the problem with the consumerism and using the GDP as our growth index? So I think that went a bit into that direction. Rinchin, the last part of the question, like what lies ahead in the struggle for equity and justice, I would like you to also give us your perspective before we close this discussion.
So, yeah, I think again we need to again look at the control over resources, who has control over resources, who consumes how much, like who consumes and who pays the price. Like earlier, we've discussed that when we talk about increase in consumption, we also have to look at whose consumption, because the same, at least the places where coal is being mined, or when we talk about rural India, or the Adivasi population, the Dalit population of this country, how much resources are being utilized by them, how much resources are controlled by them, and how much resources are being controlled by others, and for whose profit when things happen, who benefits from that. So I think when we talk about our struggle towards equity and justice, that is what we need to look at. It's the most basic thing, but I think each time you think of it, it cannot be reiterated. Enough that when we know the pyramid grid, we know that how many percent people control all the resources in this country and how many consume and utilize. So unless we answer that question, unless we realize that there is a redistribution of wealth, there is a redistribution of power, there is a redistribution of even decision making in this country, there can be nothing that we can that can be equitable, and even there can be no hope for justice. I mean, that it will never be justice, and it will never be equitable. So I think it has to start from a redistribution of power and resources, and and therefore the work has to be different. It has to be more participation in decision making. The communities that are most affected, their participation in decision making and their control over the resources, them being able to say what is happening and what should come where. So and it can't just be dependent on CSR projects and on just what the company decides can give. And that also, we know, to a large extent is hogwash. It doesn't really go to the most affected and most marginalized populations. So for me, I think there's no shortcut to that. There is this, and for us to, that it has to start from a complete, there has to be a much more radical understanding of equity and of justice than just sustainability, because we can't just say because we cannot sustain it and because this form cannot be sustained, so we do it a little better. It's like saying that because someone's arm will break because I hit it too hard, so you hit it softly, but the fact is that there should be no stick and there should be no arm that is getting hurt. So that we need to, that's something that needs to be that's the crux of the issue: redistribution of resources and power. And participation in this whole development, people's participation, the affected people's participation in in the way that in the decisions that are made and what is considered to be development in this country. That needs to be seen.
Thank you. That was very insightful. And I think all of us should now start reflecting our actions and our choices and see where we can make things better or contribute to also better participation of people who are affected. Yeah. Okay, so then again, one more last question. Can we do something to encourage or enable better participation across all sections of society? Do you think so, Shripad and Rinchin?
Yes, I think the answer to that can only be yes. And I think, but what can be done? I think it is for each of us to see in our own situations and circumstances, what can be done. And both, at our immediate level and also at a larger level to try and influence the way the systems and the laws and other structures are structured in this country.
Yeah, of course, yes. And I think two, three things. One is acknowledging our privilege, looking at the consumer, if we just talk of consumerism, then looking at our own patterns, understanding the system, understanding our privilege, and also I think extending solidarity and support to the struggles that are on the ground, to be more clued to them, to understand them, because to a lot of times people in cities would usually think कि वहाँ पे even when people young people and not necessarily maybe in this audience but to a large extent urban privileged young people would also think, when they think of people marching on the streets or even like the farmer struggle, you wonder why you think that these are politically motivated movements. One thinks that these are people being ये लोगों को भड़का के ऐसी चीजें हो रही है, or just generally have an apathy to that. You're not being able to understand why is it that people are out on the streets. When we hear of roadblocks, or for example, like when the POSCO movement was going on, there was this whole thing that children are also sitting in dharnas, and the government was wondering why parents are making their children sit. So it's not about why parents are making their children sit, it is as to why people are forced to come out on the streets to fight. Why are people braving winter? Why are people braving monsoons and fighting for their survival? So I think to be more prudent and to understand these struggles and to show support and solidarity at a time when all these struggles are being repressed. All people who are now raising their voice against displacement, raising their voice just against environmental pollution, are people who are being termed as anti-national now. There are cases of UAPA being put against people who are struggling in these places, whether they're lawyers. For example, the Bhima Koregaon case, many of the people who are arrested, like Mahesh, Sudha Bharadwaj, etc., people who were fighting for the rights of these communities, people who were talking about Gram Sabhas, about environmental laws, fighting against wrongful land acquisitions, and these are people who are now in jail being called anti-national. So I think it is also for us, when people hear, acha, wo to, those people are like that, or if they're in jail, they must have done something. I think it is also for us to try to understand. Father Stan, for example, in Jharkhand, which is a place that is like right now it is in the eye of the storm in terms of mining and the kind of the effects that mining has, whether it is Adani or Ambani. Same for Chhattisgarh. So, and people from these areas, people who spend their lives working and fighting to safeguard the rights of these people, are in jail now. So I think also lending our support to that, trying to understand what these people were doing, and then becoming a part of the larger movement. I think as an informed citizen, I think that at least is our duty. And in these times when repression is growing, I think we need to raise our voice, but in an informed way, because it's not just about raising a voice or saying that, standing for someone or standing for a struggle. But the more you get involved and the more you start learning, I think at least there will be, and the more on the ground that you are, there will be an understanding of the complete skewed version that privileged people have about this world, because we live in a bubble that we don't even understand that just our just our existence is at the cost of violation of someone else's right. That is the situation in this country today, whether it is of a coal mine worker or a sanitary worker or anyone. Just the way that the lives that we lead every day, there is, just to do that, there is a violation of someone um, else's rights. And to be at least aware of that and then start working towards a change is something that I think we all need to do. um, so at least that commitment. And I think young students, whether it was Fridays for Future or a lot of people, when they were talking about environmental rights and the right to clean environment, from there going into human rights, to resource distribution, to exploitation of a large part of Dalit, Adivasi and Bahujan population, that all and the kind of control over resources, all that is in a continuum, and from here we have to go to there. And unless we get committed to change on every level, nothing is going to change. So I think that commitment we all need to have, and that we all can do, as long as we are ready to also give up some of our own privileges, which starts from first acknowledging them.
Thank you so much for this very empowering closing words. And I think all of us know that we can do something, that there is hope, and that we do have a responsibility to contribute to change and to contribute to achieve those SDGs. It's not something which is, the SDGs are not something which are just meant for discussion in the UN plenary or in isolated research centers and policy centers. They're very much connected to our everyday life, and all of us have the power and the responsibility to contribute to achieving them. So thank you once again very much for making the time to joining us. And I wish you a nice evening and a nice weekend.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share our thoughts. And I think very enriching for us to also be able to reflect on some of these things again and again. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. ठीक है हाँ हाँ कोई रास्ता निकल आता है